Good morning, everybody. It's Monday, May 15th. I obviously am not with you today. I'll be back with you guys on Wednesday. Please make sure that you bring your Forrest Gump movie paper with you on Wednesday so that we can finish that up and turn that in. Today, you're going to go through this video, through your discussion question that you see there on the screen, go through, get your vocabulary. Today's assignment is comparing the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq as we take on the war on terrorism. Last class, we talked about the September 11th attacks and how that launched us into a war on terror. So we'll kind of look at the assignment today and looking at the war on terrorism. And then the mental health check for quarter 4 is also in today's module. So go ahead and use the time in class today to knock that out. If you get done everything early, green books are on the table so you can finish up your test corrections if you haven't done that. And if you need to get ahead on something else for another class, that's fine as well. Today's discussion question on the left says the United Nations, of course, was created after World War II, after we had defeated Hitler and defeated the Japanese. And the purpose of the UN was to keep us out of war and to keep any one country from launching a war unilaterally, meaning all by itself. So the question today is, would it ever be okay for the United States to launch an attack on another country if the United Nations hasn't given their permission for us to do that? Clearly, the U.S. is one of the leaders in the UN. So is it ever okay, in your opinion, for the United States to launch an attack on another country if the other countries in the United Nations have not given their blessing for us to do that? So pause the video so that you can get your thoughts written down for that one. And then when you're ready, go ahead and resume and jump into today's themes. All right, so we are today going to label our page 2002-2003, the launch of MySpace as a social media giant, coming big for a lot of college students initially there in 2002. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone hits the bookshelves for the first time in the U.S., and eventually those Harry Potter books will, of course, hit the big screen and make a very successful series of movies. Spider-Man, Finding Nemo, Lord of the Rings, also big at the box office. On television, animated series like South Park and Family Guy become very popular. SpongeBob, because, well, quite frankly, you don't have to pay any actors. So you can keep the show running as long as you want. So they're very, very big hits. In music, the hip-hop industry is booming. Artists like 50 Cent, Jay-Z, Nelly, but also R&B, soul music, soulful singers like Beyonce, Mariah Carey, of course, Kanye, big in that time period, as well as Eminem. With reality shows becoming more and more popular and the music industry expanding, American Idol debuts its first season on Fox in 2003, with Kelly Clarkson becoming the first American Idol winner. And in sports, the New England Patriots, heavy underdogs with a 6th-round draft pick out of Michigan, Tom Brady stunned the heavily favored Rams to win the Super Bowl, while Tim Duncan and the Spurs take home the NBA title. And Serena Williams follows up her sister's success with a win at Wimbledon. 6 straight Tour de France bicycling victories for Lance Armstrong as well. After the 2000 census is completed, the United States government now has data showing that Hispanic Americans have now surpassed African Americans as the biggest minority group in the United States, a clear sign that the improving U.S. economy was attracting a lot of workers from Mexico and other parts of Latin America to come and be a part of this growing workforce. In California, the former Hollywood star of Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger, is selected as the governor after a recall election displaces former Governor Gray Davis. So Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Governator, as they called him in the media, becomes the new governor in California. And Martha Stewart, the big media mogul, goes to prison for using her inside knowledge of the stock market to do insider trading. It forced her to resign as the CEO of her company, Martha Stewart Living, and she spent some time in prison for those charges. In Houston, Texas, a devastating story of a mother who drowned her 5 children. Andrea Yates, evaluated by mental health experts, that she had just kind of gone out of her mind and killed her entire family. It was a big criminal story that year out of South Texas. In the D.C., Baltimore area, a stepfather and his stepson launched a series of sniper shootings around the Maryland, Virginia, D.C. area, killing 10 people. They were eventually brought to justice, found asleep in their car on the side of Interstate 95 in Virginia. Both would be sentenced to life in prison. Actually, the stepfather eventually sentenced to the death penalty. And in Pakistan, a journalist kidnapped by al-Qaeda terrorists and killed as a way of al-Qaeda continuing to try to intimidate the U.S. government. We have begun our war on terror, and initially the U.S. government's target is Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, who are supposedly based out of Afghanistan. The problem in Afghanistan is that the Afghani government is very weak, and in many places are trying to support the terrorist groups like al-Qaeda, which help fund them. The biggest group that's in charge in Afghanistan is a group known as the Taliban, which is a very radical fundamentalist Islamic group that protected al-Qaeda. Again, al-Qaeda was funding a lot of the Taliban and the Afghani government. And so the Taliban was being very uncooperative with U.S. forces at turning over al-Qaeda members like bin Laden. So removing the Taliban from power was one of our real major goals in Afghanistan. President Bush announces in his State of the Union address that the United States' war on terror focuses on eliminating what he calls an axis of evil. He included countries like North Korea, Iraq, and Iran on that list, as well as Afghanistan. He believed that many of these countries were harboring terrorists and were also building weapons that they could then sell to various terrorist organizations. In response to Bush's speech, Iran starts banning American commercials. They do not appreciate being put into Bush's axis of evil. This is a country we obviously have a shaky history with since the hostage crisis in the 70s, and it's just made it a little bit worse through that speech. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks and launching the war on terror, President Bush gets Congress to agree to create a new cabinet department, the Homeland Security Department, which will focus exclusively on monitoring terrorist activity. Congressman Tom Ridge of Pennsylvania named the first Homeland Security Secretary. It is the fifth and most recent cabinet department to be added to our executive branch. The war in Afghanistan officially begins in late 2001. The war has really two goals: to dismantle al-Qaeda and bring Osama bin Laden to justice, and to remove the corrupt Taliban that is supporting them from power. Those are the two stated missions of why we send soldiers into Afghanistan. Unfortunately, we are not aware of it yet, but bin Laden has actually migrated out to Pakistan, which is why it's going to take so long to find him. But we do find a lot of his highest ranking al-Qaeda operatives. Early on, we have a great deal of success. It seems like we're just going to breeze through eliminating the Taliban. But after things seem to quiet down a little bit in the summer of 2002, it heated back up by the fall. Many of the Taliban government officials had armed citizens and were sending them in, equipping them with car bombs and anything they could get their hands on to push back. And so what we saw was what we call an insurgency, which is where regular people rise up and push back. So civilians begin rising up and doing everything they can to make things uncomfortable for U.S. forces and pushing back, dragging this thing in Afghanistan longer than we thought that we intended to be there. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld then calls President Bush into a meeting at the Pentagon and says to him, "We have very, very reliable, credible evidence that we believe that our old friend Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, is potentially building weapons of mass destruction that he intends to somehow sell to al-Qaeda and various other terrorist organizations." For the first time publicly, Bush uses the phrase weapons of mass destruction in the speech, or WMDs, to refer to these nuclear or chemical or radiological weapons that some governments are building that can do significant damage. You're talking about weapons that can kill thousands and thousands of people in an instant. This creates a great deal of fear that a dictator like Hussein, who has tortured his own people, who has already invaded other countries like Kuwait with no respect for other countries' sovereignty, that he may in fact try to profit off of these weapons and sell them to bin Laden and al-Qaeda. So Bush needs to act swiftly, he believes, to keep this from happening. Bush goes to the United Nations and says, "We have information from my Defense Department that Iraq is going to be aiding al-Qaeda, that we need to do something together as a group, as the United Nations. We need to push back and take action, and we probably need to put Hussein out of office." He gets Congress's permission to pass a resolution that gives him the authority to do whatever he needs to do to get Hussein pushed out of office. But ultimately, he's going to find not as many allies as he hoped in the UN. His biggest ally is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Tony Blair, who agrees with Bush that Iraq is a major threat moving forward. Several other countries, including Hungary, Italy, Poland, also jumped on board, supporting the statement of the U.S. and wanting to be there by our side after 9/11. And when Secretary of State Colin Powell, the first African-American to hold that spot, goes before the UN and testifies that there's even photographic evidence of what they believe are weapon sites that Iraq is building with these WMDs, he does start to convince some in the room that perhaps Iraq needs to be dealt with, but he doesn't convince everybody. Two prominent leaders, the president of France and the chancellor of Germany, are skeptical. they don't see enough evidence that clearly supports that Iraq actually has these weapons. They've seen the photographs of what looks to be potential weapon building sites, but they call into question, have we actually seen the weapons? And furthermore, the president of France goes as far as to say, well, if we kick Saddam Hussein out of power, who's going to take over? We know he's a dictator. We know he's bad, but he's also keeping the Iranians in check. Iran and Iraq are rival countries, kind of keeping each other in check. And his fears that if we remove Hussein from power, who's going to take over? Do the Americans want to just permanently stay in Iraq? That's probably not going to be efficient, probably very expensive. So France is going to be one of our allied countries that does not support our efforts in Iraq. And because of that, several members of Congress push back against the French. One of them is a Republican congressman from North Carolina, Walter Jones, who starts encouraging Americans to protest anything that has anything to do with France. It gets kind of rhetorical to the point where some restaurants will no longer refer to French fries as French fries. They start referring to them as freedom fries as a way to kind of protest France's refusal to support the United States in our efforts to remove Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq. So it gets a little silly to some point. President Bush, however, now feels that he has enough support. He might not have the French support or the German support, but along with the British and the Hungarians and the Polish and other forces, he feels like he has enough justification to call for Saddam Hussein to leave power. After Hussein threatened a couple of U.S. surveillance planes, Bush comes out publicly and says, you have 48 hours, telling Saddam Hussein to leave Baghdad, to get out, take you and your sons and get out. Hussein quickly goes on television, tells the Iraqi people to take up arms, that the Americans are likely going to invade and that we should fight to the death. Meanwhile, he loots $1 billion out of the central bank account and goes into hiding. He and his sons are trying to flee the country, but they're going to tell all the people, just like Hitler did in World War II, to keep fighting. Thus, in 2003, the United States sent its first group of ground troops on into Iraq for what we called Operation Iraqi Freedom, which was the code name for the operation to remove the dictator Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq. Initially, just like in Afghanistan, it moves pretty quick. In just a couple of days, they have reached the capital of Baghdad. They have run Hussein out of there. And the Iraq War, as we come to call it, a 9-year-long battle, is officially underway. The Iraq War basically had two stated missions: to find the weapons of mass destruction that Iraq supposedly was building and trying to sell, and to remove the dictator Saddam Hussein from power and try to help institute a democratic government in Iraq. In total, an estimated 150 to 600,000 Iraqis are killed in the first couple of years alone. But this thing is going to drag on far longer than anyone would have anticipated. The United States will be in Iraq until 2011, when President Barack Obama officially begins the process of bringing soldiers home. But swiftly in Baghdad, the statue of Saddam Hussein comes down. His two sons are killed, but initially they cannot find Saddam. It'll be several months until eventually soldiers find an underground bunker area where Hussein had been hiding out in Tikrit. In Operation Red Dawn, U.S. forces are able to successfully find Hussein living underground and bring him to justice. He will go before a military tribunal and eventually be put to death. In the meantime, President Bush has taken a victory lap. In May, he essentially says that we've been successful in Iraq. A billboard behind him says mission accomplished. And this is going to be unfortunate because it's going to lead many people to believe that the Iraq war is over, when in fact, it's really just beginning. Another insurgency occurs, civilians taking up arms, issuing car bombs, shooting at U.S. forces. It's going to be a long, drawn-out war. Many people in the Islamic world who feel like the United States is meddling into their territory and trying to force a style of government on them that they do not want. Meanwhile, back at home, the escalating price of the war is starting to cause the stock market to go back in the wrong direction. Unemployment is now starting to go up. We're starting to go into a recession. It's back above 6%. And we're on the verge of what's going to eventually be a major housing crisis. In the short term, a lot of loans are going out. The Federal Reserve reduces interest rates. A lot of Americans who can't afford nice homes are taking out loans on nice homes, and that's going to come up to catch up with us when we get to 2008. Meanwhile, across the sea in the UK, protesters begin pushing back against Bush and Tony Blair. During a visit to London, Bush is alarmed by the number of protesters who are pushing back against what's happening in Iraq. A senior State Department official basically testifies that, well, perhaps they had modified some evidence. They wanted to go into Iraq for the oil and maybe not so much for the weapons of mass destruction. Bush is even heard going on record admitting that Iraq actually did not have anything to do with 9/11. However, he still maintains that they are supporting terrorism and that they are building WMDs. And he maintains that it's still a noble cause to go in and try to stop these weapons from being built. So that's where we're headed for next time. America is now fighting two wars, a war in Afghanistan and a war in Iraq. And what you're going to do in today's assignment is you use web sources to kind of compare the two battles as America wages its war on terror. And once you've done that, please make sure you've turned that in Canvas, and then the mental health check is there as well. Take care, guys. I will see you guys on Wednesday. See ya.